Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar event. My name is Joshua. I'm going to be your presenter today. Before we get started on our topic here, a few technical things. Click the little red arrow on the sidebar of your webinar control panel to minimize that webinar control panel. If you've got a single monitor set up, this is particularly important. It allows you to get the full visual effect of the presentation. Or, if you've got a dual monitor set up, just drag that control panel off to your second desktop again, just to get it out of the way. We're going to be here together for the next 20 minutes or so till about 11:50 or 51 Eastern Time. Wherever we are, I'm going to wrap up right at about that time. I'll be happy to stick around and answer questions for you if you have them. If you have questions, please type those into the questions portion of the webinar control panel. I'll do my best to keep an eye on those, and we'll see what we can't do to get those answered. Simply do ask you to keep the questions on topic here. So basically about our transaction basics. Today's event is being recorded, so the video of today's event will be out on our support center here sometime in the next 24 hours, 48 hours or so, probably less, maybe even later today, if you want to revisit that. Finally, the topic I'm using or the pages I'm using are the workbook A103, pages 3 and 4. So again, workbook pages A103, pages 3 and 4. So before we get started on our topic, one final thing I want to kind of mention here is it talks about basic transactions, but really what I think this event should have been named, if you kind of read the fine print under it, it details what it talks about. We're really not going to be talking about transaction types in Church Windows today. We're kind of really talking about transaction basics, okay? Different types of transactions, transaction numbers, effects of debits and credits and things like that. But we're not going to really kind of go through bills and payments and income and journal entries and all that other stuff. There's just not enough time for that. So if we go on to our page 3 here and talk about basic transactions, general information, I guess that's the other part about it, is the general information. So let's jump into accounting here real quick. So basically the first bullet there talks about transaction types and transaction numbers. So each time a transaction is posted in Church Windows, it doesn't matter where it comes from, folks, whether it's in accounting directly, whether it's transactions which are transferred in from donations, or whether they're payroll transactions which are posted in from payroll, the software assigns both a unique transaction number to each one of them, each one of the transactions, and an abbreviation for the type of transaction that is posted. Okay, so the best place that I can kind of show this here is if we go to transactions and browse, we see let me get out my highlighter friend here just to kind of draw some focus. Over here on the left-hand side of our browse, we have our column called transaction number and transaction type. So each one of our transactions is assigned both a unique number and a transaction type, okay? The type of transactions with their associated abbreviations are listed there on page 3 in that box, okay? And let me kind of widen out our transaction type column here, spread that out a little bit. See, so it says transaction number at the top left there and transaction type. So if I click on the transaction number column and I flip that around, we go right up to the very top. It is important to know that these transactions we start over with transaction number 1 each and every year. So transaction numbers don't carry over and just start the next number. They always start the next accounting year with transaction number 1. So as we can see here, our transaction number 1 is a bill that we entered, and the transaction number 2 is a bill. Basically, the first handful were bills. But I think, again, the descriptions or the abbreviations are pretty clear in terms of what they are. The closest that may be a little bit less clear if you're not paying attention would be payments and payroll, PYMT versus PYRL. So we got our payments down here, but eventually when we scroll down, we should see some payroll entries in here too somewhere. Yeah, sorry, I thought we had some payroll in here. We should have. I'm not sure why we don't have that in this. There it is. There's our payroll, some of our payroll. So right here, payroll. I changed the sort to transaction number, so I had posted those payroll transactions in our training data here later. So yeah, we do have our payroll PYRL transactions here. Okay. So again, as the workbook page talks about at the bottom of page 3, so transaction number 1025 INCM is an income transaction. 1026 TNFR is a transfer transaction. BILLs would be bills. So again, the descriptors just help us understand what type of transaction we're working with and dealing with it. For me as a technician who's supporting you, this information is invaluable to try to help me troubleshoot some of your problems. It should be invaluable to you too in terms of helping you understand what the data is telling you. Okay? So both the transaction numbers and transaction types are very, very important information available to you that will help tell you what occurred. Okay? This event, folks, may not go on all 20 minutes. We'll see. And then when we flip up to page 4 and we talk about each one of these 4 bullet points that are remaining here on this or at the top of this, so it says here transaction numbers are numbered in sequence as they are entered into the system. Each year's transactions begin with number 1. Our old system didn't used to do that. Okay, the old financial used to literally just carry over and pick up with the first transaction number in the next year was the next immediate number from the last transaction number that was in the prior year. Not now in accounting. In accounting, every year starts with a new transaction number 1. Okay, but again, every entry is assigned a transaction type. So it says, then on second bullet point talks about each time a transaction is entered, a date occurred can be selected or chosen, which is the date that you're asking the transaction to affect your books, essentially. Okay, and it always falls within the accounting year that you're in. Okay, it's basically, again, the date that the accounts are affected and that the reports will show that the transaction has affected the accounts. Okay. The third bullet, and this is, again, another very important bit of information here. Okay, so when we're looking at our browse transactions here, we see the column called date occurred right here, date occurred. That's the date we're asking the system to affect our accounts. Okay, but then further to the right, we see another column called date posted. Okay, so when we come on over here, I'm pretty sure it's here somewhere, and then in here, due date posted, right over here on the far right, right here. That is the date that Church Windows systematically assigns to the transaction that's based on the date that you're sitting at the computer when you post those transactions. Okay, you have no control over date posted. Okay. The only date that you have control over is date occurred. So basically you can say, okay, I want to show a list of all of the transactions I posted on this particular date, regardless of the date occurred, it'll show you that. Okay? So you can ask and query on the column or field called date posted. In fact, I'm just sharing with you, that's how I would print my reports when I get to the end of the day is I wouldn't print them after I post them. I would just go into my transaction journal, put in the date posted, and for the date that I was sitting at the machine, and it'll just literally print out every transaction in one single report that I posted that day. So just an FYI, it could save you some paper and some printing expense on that. Okay, and finally, the final bullet point talks about when passwords are used to get into Church Windows, or one is required, a username and password. The system will also assign the username to each transaction for the user who posted that entry. So right over here again on the far right, we see the column called user. Now we don't have, usernames or soft login requirements or credentials required to get into our data here. But if we did, that name or my name or whoever posted these transactions would show up here. So again, you can then query on a particular user's information by going in. We go to say something like change year, filter, and sort here over on the upper left here, we see the field called user. So if you want to see what a particular user did, you can just type in that user information or username right there and then click OK, and it'll show you what that user posted, okay, including reverse transactions if you wish, okay? So lots of useful information involving some transaction basics like transaction numbers and transaction types. And frequently, again, one of the things I like to show here about our transactions, like right here under our filter tab, we see down the right side here that you can say, okay, I want to see just a particular type of transaction. I use this, folks, on my support calls all the time, okay? So I just click clear all. It unchecks all the boxes, and I can just check a bills, or if I want to see those, or journal entries, or transfers, or a combination of them, okay? But this simply allows us to isolate particular transaction types that we want to see, and omitting any of the others if we don't want to see those, okay? Again, lots of power here in these transaction types and transaction numbers. Similarly, I can go right up here to transaction number on my change your field transaction browser options here and ask the software to display a single transaction or a range of transaction numbers if I wish, okay? So those numbers and transaction types are vitally important, okay? Okay, so finally, on page 4 there, dual entry. So it's important to understand, and for folks who are not familiar with, bookkeeping or accounting systems, Church Windows Accounting is a dual entry fund accounting system, okay? So what that means is for every transaction, there are 2 accounts. There's a debit account and a credit account, okay? There is no way that we can post a one-sided transaction in Church Windows, okay? I can't just go in and post a transaction that affects just one account, okay? Simply not possible. So we get this question through support a lot, but for every transaction, there is a debit and a credit, okay? So if I go up here and I say, look at my bill number, say 260, well, let's go up here and let's see if we can find something. Let's go right up to the top to number 1 up here, bill. So we notice transaction number 1, let's go back and ask for that. So we're going to go up here and we're going to ask for number 1, transaction through number 1, click OK. So right here, we see our 2 lines, the debit and the credit side of our bill transaction, okay? So one side is the debit, one side is the credit. So if I click on, say, my view button here, we see my debit was to my telephone expense, my credit was to my vendor AT&T, okay? So again, you might have, in cases things like journal entries or multi-point bills where you've got 2 expenses, you might have 3 lines or 4 or 6 or 8 lines as part of a transaction, but you're never going to have anything less than 2. So the effects of debits and credits is really important. And for folks, again, who are unfamiliar with accounting and bookkeeping, in a double entry or dual entry system, the debit effect and the credit effect on assets and expenses is oftentimes very confusing, okay? When I started for Computer Helper years ago, I thought a debit always meant decrease and a credit meant increased. In a double entry or dual entry system, that is not the case, okay? Yeah, so in terms of we see there on numbers 1 and number 5, the first and the last under those account types, we notice that a debit to an asset and an expense increases their account balance and a credit decreases it, okay? Because again, when we're posting these types of transactions, we're raising and lowering account balances, and we have to do that equally. So simply how the double entry accounting system works is the only way that can work is when we have a debit and a credit to the asset and the expense are the opposite of what we might normally expect, okay? The liabilities fund, income accounts, those all raise those account balances, okay? But in the case of the expenses, when we debit that, it increases it because it doesn't report as a negative value. It's showing that we've spent more money through that expense account. Okay, so that's why it shows up. It's a positive value. It raises its account balance, okay? And an asset, a debit, is reflecting of a deposit or an increase in our cash account. and a credit to an asset is a decrease or a payment out of that. It works, folks. The more you work with it, the easier it gets and the clearer it becomes, okay? But just be aware that as a dual entry accounting system, the debits and credits effects on accounts may not be what you typically expect. If you have questions or you're unclear about how that works and you need help with that, by all means, please contact our support technicians, such as myself, and I'll be happy to try to clarify that for you in terms of how that works, okay? All right, so with a few minutes left, that is our topic for the day.